You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Hello, I'm Nathan Goodman, and I'm a senior fellow here with the Hayek Program. Today I'm joined by Timothy Dunn, a professor of sociology at Salisbury University. He is the author of multiple books on U.S. border policies. These include his 2009 book, Blockading the Border and Human Rights, the El Paso operation that remade immigration enforcement, and his 1996 book, The Militarization of the U.S. Mexico Border, 1978 to 1992, Low-Intensity Conflict Doctrine Comes Home, which has been a big influence on my own work. So, Professor Dunn, welcome to the Hayek Program podcast.
Thank you. And can I plug one other book?
Oh, absolutely. Please do.
I'm sorry, but I forgot to write that in. It is an edited volume that came out in 2021. It is called Human Security, Borders, and Migration. And it's looking at the issue of case studies from all over the world, from Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, Europe, the United States, North America, and a little bit in Asia as well. It's really a lovely volume. And I did a bit of an updated take on border militarization in that volume as well.
Fantastic. Well, I'll look forward to checking that out. Thank you for bringing that to my attention and to our listeners' attention.
Yeah, and it's the lead, co-editor, the lead editor was Natalia Ribas Mateos from the University of Barcelona. And she included me on as a co-editor for the volume. And it was a delight to read all that wonderful, fascinating work. I've never seen such a collection that is so eclectic and has such a range and just really fascinating work.
That sounds fantastic. Yeah, I mean, getting at that kind of transnational comparative approach seems really useful for understanding the range of bordering regimes and policies.
It certainly does. And there's a fairly large focus. One of the units of the book is all on the U.S. Mexico border. So that is a central focus, but there are like 6 units in the book, and it's just, lots and lots of different case studies from around the world. That's just amazing.
That sounds really great. Do they get into some of the interaction effects between these different border policies? Because I know Todd Miller in his Empire of Borders has covered a lot of how, for instance, the U.S. through BORTAC has trained and influenced border policies in other countries. Do they get at some of that international interaction?
Sadly, no, there's not. We did not have a kind of a comprehensive thread of pulling that together. That would be the project of someone else looking at this to kind of draw those connections. But certainly you can see a lot of commonalities in the case studies. And Todd is a co-author of a chapter on the U.S. Mexico border and did a great job with, I forgot the other colleague he wrote it with. And his work is certainly, hugely influential and extremely well researched and, really does draw those parallels that are just, astounding how clear he makes those things.
Yeah, absolutely. He does such important work. So as listeners have already been able to discern, we're here today to talk about borders. And so before we dive into your work, I'd like to learn a bit about how you began doing that work. So what first drew you to sociology, which is your academic discipline, and then what led you to specialize in studying borders within that?
Sociology, like most people, I had never heard of it in before college. I looked in junior high and high school. We have social studies and history and government and civics and things like that, but not a sociology per se, but little elements of it and different things. And then when I got to undergrad, I took an introductory class and had a great instructor at Hamline University, Martin Markowitz. And he introduced the topic so beautifully. And his colleague, Maggie Jensen, I also took her for an early class as well. And they just really put it together and talked the language that I understood. I said, oh, okay, I found the thing that thinks like I think, that looks at all these disparate elements of society and how they're related, and study of human social interaction in a broad sense, both at the micro level as well as at the institutional large scale level, and eventually looking, in world systems theory and other things, looking at, the global aspects of these connections of varying types of human social behavior in a variety of institutions, not just in politics and the government, or not solely in the economy, or not solely in culture, but in all of those and others, and how they are related to each other, and how human actors, carry out their lives in them, and have agency to try to change them, as well as are affected by that broader social environment. So when I got into that, and they had a very critical kind of mindset about how society is set up, which I was, coming at things from my own background as a child during the 60s and 70s. Me and my brothers were draft age, and one of whom enlisted, and the other was ready to go to Canada, but he missed by one number, thank goodness, in his draft call up. And my parents were very supportive of the civil rights movement. My father even lost his job over it, supporting Martin Luther King Jr. In the South when we lived there for 4 years. And we just thought, okay, these issues are really important. Then, of course, the Watergate era and all the skeptics and the revelations in the intelligence community, the church committee, and all the things that came out of it that I was barely cognizant of. But I was really watching this stuff carefully from a young age, because my parents were really, and my siblings were very focused on it. And, just learned about the abuses of power, and the skepticism toward institutions that are using power unchecked, not giving them the benefit of the doubt when they've especially shown they did not deserve it. So, a real transitional period for me coming out of that. And I, during that time, was also in the 70s as a teenager, starting to hear a lot more about immigration. And so, there were this is when unauthorized immigration really grew to, that kind of magical threshold of over 1 million apprehensions by the Border Patrol as kind of this crisis point. And now many of those were multiple apprehensions of the same people repeatedly, so it wasn't really 1 million people, but it made it sound very, very large scale. And this was coming off the end of the Bracero program in 1964 when it ended, which had allowed up to 450,000 people a year come with visas to work temporarily. They ended that because there were a lot of abuses in the program and so on. It wasn't well monitored, but they didn't replace it with anything. And then the labor demand for those primarily agricultural workers in the Southwest was still there, and in some areas of the Midwest as well, and elsewhere. And so people who had come by and large legally, came without papers, came illegally, because the labor demand was still there, and they filled those jobs. And then this became, so the migration didn't really shift much. The legal status of it did. And this then became the crisis, as it was portrayed in the media, lots of documentaries and news stories and politicians jumping on. And President Carter created a select committee on immigration headed by the president of Notre Dame, Theodore Hesburgh, who had this kind of moral authority as a Catholic religious leader, and also someone who had been involved in the civil rights movement as a supporter. That they gave it a certain urgency, and this committee then, it really responded to this and helped set the agenda. And their report came out during the Reagan era. But at any rate, there's just this building kind of crisis narrative about immigration that started, for me, I started noticing that in the mid to late 70s as a teenager. And then I've seen ever since that it constantly comes back up. It's not a continual crisis in the news media and so on, but it comes up every several years, and it just has been pretty much unending. So I've watched that as a citizen, and then try to document some of that in my work. It's how this emerging kind of political crisis narrative from time to time then informs policy. And what does that mean at the border? Particularly, I was thinking, these are people, it was pretty evident, people were not harmful. They were coming to work. There's certainly a few bad actors in there, but for the most part, just honest people coming to work who need to provide for their families and are unable to do so, particularly after the economic crisis in Mexico in 1982 was so drastic. The lost decade thereafter, really a Great Depression-like period for Mexico and much of Latin America, and the wars in Central America that the U.S. was deeply involved in that, led to the deaths of at least 250,000 people in the 1980s. in these civil wars, and led to a big outmigration, and really the first large scale migration of Central Americans to the United States, joining Mexicans. So that's kind of how I came to it through looking at those issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you were coming out of a period of having seen the abusive militarism of the Vietnam War, and then you saw the US government and various political entrepreneurs frame unauthorized immigration after they removed authorization. They framed that unauthorized immigration as a crisis. And of course, when political entrepreneurs can see something as a crisis, that creates a lot of opportunities to expand political power and expand militarized power. So a big theme in your work has been border militarization. So what do you mean by border militarization? What are some of the dimensions of that?
Well, I'd like to highlight though the entrepreneurial aspect, like you or have stressed in your work. I think that's really important. In sociology, Douglas Massey and colleagues have done that. The longstanding founders of the Mexican Migration Project, a more than 40-year long study of migration from Mexico to the U.S. And that helped me introduce me to that concept as well of looking at how politicians and news media and bureaucrats ahead of enforcement programs like the Border Patrol and CBP and ICE and so on can use this crisis narrative to justify, more, rally up votes for voters, get more viewers and clicks and more relevance, and then get a lot more resources, such as we just seen with ICE getting a quadrupling of their resources in the tax cut bill that just passed. So that identifying how that works or has worked for various actors to promote a sort of dehumanizing narrative about people. And I think Massey and colleagues were very helpful in pointing out that this dehumanization has really been going on for a long time, and that particularly through the media, of course, and this has a real social psychological impact on people, so that we tend to see immigrants as less than fully human and not deserving of, dignified treatment, regardless of what they've done or fairness or due process or anything. So that, President Trump didn't, begin that, but he has taken that to a higher level, building on certainly a history of previous work, and then that kind of idea goes back pretty far in American history about immigration in other periods as well. So it's kind of the contemporary version of that. As for our militarization, I was looking at early news reports and stuff I saw with like the Border Patrol. They're looking at everybody's framing this as, oh, these people are migrant workers. They're largely coming to work, working illegal, and they had helicopters and electronic surveillance equipment of the day. The ground sensors and so on, and a kind of what seemed to be sort of like a paramilitary sort of police force in the Border Patrol going after them. And I just thought, that's really weird. It's just like a disproportional response to an issue that's not a physical threat to the country. It's an economic and policy issue that should be addressed, but again, these people don't seem to be any meaningful threat. And again, certainly some criminals in the mix, but turns out not a whole lot. The research shows less than for natives, and this is a self-selected, highly motivated group coming to earn a living for their families and or seeking safety from persecution, and then trying to work and take care of their families. And I thought this just seems like a very wrong-headed response. And it's kind of that thing. If your only tool in the toolbox is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Our tool is this set of coercive and increasingly militarized resources that are really more appropriate for some kind of physical threat to the nation, and that's not what this is. And responding in that fashion is bound to lead to harmful outcomes. So that's kind of where I started. And by militarization, I took the term to mean I was looking at from some research from my colleagues in graduate school at the University of Texas at Austin, and some colleagues also from Minnesota worked, a little bit at the University of Minnesota, and some additional undergrad work and some activist work there, and Central America work, solidarity work, or resource center kind of educational work. People were looking at, what does U.S. military doctrine look like in Central America? And we weren't going to involve a lot of U.S. troops in the post-Vietnam era. The Vietnam syndrome, the fear of intervention in low-level guerrilla wars, civil wars, internal wars. There was a real reluctance on the part of the public, most importantly, and also the military to get involved in that. But clearly, the various parts of the national security apparatus were very involved in Central America, backing, allied governments that were mainly dictatorships against guerrilla forces and often against anybody who was a critic and would be called a communist and therefore fair game to be killed. And importantly, I think it's important to point out the United Nations did truth commissions at the end of the civil wars in Guatemala and El Salvador in the mid-90s, tried to assess how many people died and who was principally responsible. And they each found in both countries, like 70,000 people died in El Salvador, about 150 to 200,000, I can't remember the exact figure, in Guatemala. I think it was 200,000 over the very lengthy time period since the U.S. overthrew the government in 1954. But most of the deaths were in the late 70s through the early 90s. Then in both those cases, approximately 90 to it was either 90 or 95% were carried out by forces in the government or working with the government, shadowy death squad groups that are allied with them that were supported by the United States. And as we attempted to overthrow a left-leaning government in Nicaragua, that in the same time period that had overthrown a 40-year dictatorship that was a close U.S. ally, the Somoza's family, we backed counter-revolutionary forces there because we feared they were too allied with Cuba or the Soviet Union, this kind of Cold War paradigm. And we killed at least 40,000 people there. So you're looking upwards of, like 250, 300,000 people. And the U.S. was involved in ways that were less obvious than sending in the troops, although there was some of that on a small scale. Mostly it was through training of local indigenous forces, intelligence work, a lot of intelligence community actors, CIA and others, and a lot of equipment and State Department support, embassy support, all these kind of, and some police training agencies as well, going, we're going to train the national police to be better police. All this kind of stuff together. And in fact, one of the police training programs from the 60s and 70s that helped fuel the crisis then in the 70s, 80s, particularly 80s, Salvador was a police training program we had run in Washington, not far from Georgetown University. There was a warehouse and some kind of facilities they were using. And there was a inter-American police training program that trained a lot of people, as did the U.S. School of the Americas in Panama at that time, and then later relocated to Georgia. The military bases there that were training military officers and in some of these police programs, police and security officials, who then wound up, being on military juntas, overthrowing governments, committing grave human rights abuses. And one of which, in the case of the police training program in Washington, was Roberto de Busan, who was the head of the Arena Party later on, but was heading up death squads, and including the one that killed Archbishop Romero in 1980, that really kicked off a new level of the crisis in Central America, and in El Salvador particularly. And so, I was looking at it like, well, what's the U.S. role here? It's kind of more clandestine, but it's there. And then I was noticing, and one of my colleagues pointed out, hey, there's a whole emerging doctrine of U.S. military, and this got some attention in the left-leaning kind of Central America or Latin America-oriented press in the U.S., the NACLA report on the Americas and others, looking at what's this new doctrine that's helping guide U.S. Intervention in these newer, more subtle ways than, say, a Vietnam sort of invasion way. And it was called low-intensity conflict doctrine. And it was all about, working with everything from police to economic aid programs and food aid programs, to military units, to intelligence units, intelligence agencies domestically there, that all these nations have their own, versions of the CIA and so on, and trying to get them all coordinating and working together And the principal target was not solely the guerrilla fighting forces that they were allied against, which in both El Salvador and Guatemala were pretty small, dangerous to them, but small. The principal ground of dispute were the civilian population. And it's like you have to control the civilian population so they don't support the armed opposition, which is, proposing an agenda that's much more beneficial usually for the public, like, oh, you're going to get land and schools and healthcare and stuff, all this stuff that you've been denied, and you earn democracy. We'll eventually set up elections and so on. So it was a much more kind of comprehensive coordination of various arms of the security apparatus, broadly defined, to try to get them all on the same page, focused on this countering this enemy. And the principal area of dispute was the civilian population, not controlling territory, but controlling people. So, like labor and labor groups, labor unions, college students, student groups, particular communities that were known to be like, oh, they're in a zone that has more sympathy for the armed, guerrilla armed opposition groups and so on. But it's you really, how do you try to control these things and through more drastic repression as well as media, propaganda and other things, and occasionally some political reform sprinkled in to make it seem like, okay, things are changing at least a little bit. But the U.S. really military was part of that picture, and there were theorists in the U.S. military writing about this as, okay, this is the future. We're not going to do a counterinsurgency doctrine, which was what drove the Vietnam War, and we've seen very much in Iraq and Afghanistan, was only one part of it. That's like the higher end of violence part of it. There's all these other things on the less severe parts of the spectrum that you need to have going on as well, such as those things I mentioned, of working with all those different parts of the security apparatus, training them, equipping them, getting them to collaborate, join forces, and you're really bringing together a lot of it is the police, the military, and the intelligence community all together to kind of focus on this security issue, right? And it's like, you know, it's a very wide-ranging doctrine, and in some ways, I made a joke one time. I said, I'd like to thank the military for coming up with this because they seem to think everything is low-intensity conflict, and it has to be addressed with this model. And I said, it's kind of a totalizing view. And one of my professors shot back at me. He's like, well, something that says it's everything is essentially meaningless, right? And so what does that make this? And so I'm like, well, that's true, but it's not meaningless because they really, they're serious and they think this is a real thing. And of course, at the end of the Cold War, these conflicts wind down. They're looking for like a new mission, right? And the border pops up as, hey, this is a place where you can do some of this. And the Reagan administration earlier on had kind of moved in that direction in its first year. But particularly the Bush administration, Bush the first, HW, elected in 88, he pushed it much further. Ronald Reagan upped the war on drugs as a national security issue, and then Bush took it to the border as well. And that was his new thing. And then, the Gulf War kind of saved him. Oh, we got a real war. We can do that, right? But, that was over very quickly. And then there was more attention. These kind of low intensity conflict oriented folks in the military were like, oh, okay, this is kind of an opportunity for us to keep our budgets, and then, of course, post 9/11, this takes off like a rocket. Like the now counterinsurgency is back in fashion. The coordination of all these elements, police, military, intelligence. It's like, wow, of course, and then how do aid programs fit into this? It's just and psychological operations and manipulation. I mean, it's all back in spades. But it's also been present in a much smaller way than those wars, of course, at the U.S. Mexico border, in part because they get framed as this big security issue. It's either especially drugs or then terrorism as the big threat post 9/11. Though no terrorist has ever come to attack the United States, has been uh, apprehended crossing U.S. Mexico border. That so it's like it potentially could be a problem, but it has never, in fact, been that.
Yeah, Alex Narasta has good writing on this. It's very clear that just empirically, it's a very small problem in the real world.
And increasingly they were reluctant to put immigration in with that. But as they kind of post 9/11 got into the notion of anybody crossing the border could be potentially a terrorist, hypothetically, sure. Never caught one, but yeah, sure, okay. They broadened the term to be like transnational criminal organizations, which sounds very ominous, but TCOs, right? And so this becomes the new kind of focal point, and then includes migrant smugglers, people who bring people not against their will, but who are paid to bring people across because it's increasingly difficult to get across with increased enforcement at the border. So more people turn to smugglers, much as the Border Patrol theorized and speculated that they would as they expanded enforcement in the 90s. Their own documents said, yep, smuggling prices are going to go up. More people are going to use smugglers. So then they help create the problem, and then they say, "Oh my God, it's organized crime," which in a broad sense it is, but it's nothing nearly so dangerous as most organized crime is. And then they fall under the heading of transnational criminal organizations. And so then that justifies, oh, we can use military resources against immigrants and immigrant smuggling organizations.
And of course, when we get to some other elements of the transnational criminal organizations that they use to justify this, gangs like MS-13, for example, that's directly a result of various aspects of the low intensity conflict doctrine you're talking about, right? Because that was founded by Central American migrants who were fleeing the US backed dirty wars in El Salvador and Guatemala. And then leaders of those gangs were then deported back, which brought the gangs back to those societies, which people then fled the gang violence from those gangs. So we have a bunch of militarized state violence by the American state, fueling instability there, generating patterns of unintended consequences there and here, and providing a rationale that political entrepreneurs once again use to carry out more of the same militarized violence. It's just a vicious cycle.
Right. And MS-13 was formed as a response to the migrants' experience, particularly in Los Angeles, which had was one of the main places immigrants of all types went, but including Salvadorans, and they were being victimized by U.S. gangs, who, in that point, we think of Los Angeles as gang central, and you think in the '90s, oh man, it's the Crips and the Bloods, and they run everything. But for 30 plus years, the largest gangs and the largest number of gangs in Los Angeles area have been Latino gangs. And so they formed these principally in response to Mexican American gangs who were, they're living nearby and were being victimized by. And and yes, and then are, caught up in crime, deported, and bring the problem back to these societies that are very weak and just gutted by, years and years and years of armed conflict and economic devastation and weak institutions, just barely crawling along in a state of peace. And there's a vacuum that they fill quickly.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you get a situation where people are just being doubly brutalized by various forms of violence, both the state violence and the actions of non-state actors in response to it. So it's really tragic the way in which low intensity conflict doctrine is affecting Central Americans in particular, both at home and when they try to come here for a better life.
I would add, in the case of Mexico, which is the biggest migrant sending country, that's not an obvious case for the application of low intensity conflict doctrine. And then historically has a much stronger sense of national sovereignty, doesn't want a lot of US intervention because the U.S. Took half the country in a war, U.S. Mexico War, 1845-48, and then in the late 19th and early 20th century, invaded Mexico, varying various times, and had forces chasing Pancho Villa for over a year in northern Mexico before World War One. And so, they're very, very sensitive about U.S. armed intervention and U.S. kind of intrusion on their sovereignty. That's kind of baked into Mexico's political DNA. But one of the places where you can kind of see these elements of low intensity conflict doctrine has been through the war on drugs in Mexico, where U.S. security agencies, particularly, but some military training as well, and a lot of funding have gone into Mexican security forces to fight the narco traficantes, the drug traffickers, right, and the cartels. And one of the biggest cartel groups turns out to be guys we trained. The Zetas were a group in northern Mexico, which I think have largely since fallen by the wayside. Thankfully, they were tremendously violent. They were all ex-military guys who had a Z in their serial number because they got special anti-drug training from the U.S. Like they were the best of the best, and then they went to work for the cartels, and then they said, "Oh, hey, we can be our own cartel. We can," and they're enormously brutal in the northeastern part of Mexico, next to the Gulf cartel. And we helped create that by thinking like, okay, the way to go after these cartels is really we're going to we're going to get all the security forces together. We're going to point them at them, and we're going to go get them. And that never works. Going after kingpins does not really work in the United States as a organized crime strategy. It has had very little impact in Mexico. And the places where you could really have an impact, like financing, like money laundering, we never go after, right? And that's been the case for decades. And we occasionally put out some reports that say, "Oh my God, Citibank and UBS and all the various European banks, like forgetting the really big one in Britain that was caught, but they're very intimately involved in money laundering for cartels. They've been caught numerous times, and we just don't choose to act on that. Yeah, and so if we wanted to really make an impact, we could there, but we don't because that would involve going after more powerful actors that can defend themselves quite well in the legal system and elsewhere. But that's we are involved in a kind of low intensity conflict way through the drug war there, which has had not good results, we should say.
To say the least. Yeah, and it's just on the banks and money laundering stuff. I know, like, whenever I go into a bank or into my credit union, there are the like Patriot Act notices on the walls that there's some set of know your customer or other types of regulations that ostensibly are aimed to combat money laundering. Are there specific interventions that you're thinking would be more effective that could be carried out there that would be stronger than the sort of things that are currently done, or things that you think are especially weak about the current set of regulations aimed at preventing money laundering there?
Yeah, there's something that says like for any transaction more than $10,000 or more, you have to provide some documentation where the funds are coming from. You can't just walk in with bags of cash, put them down, go put them in my account without some form of documentation. And so for small customers, regular people who come in, like that's a pretty, that's a significant barrier. But for these larger actors, it's not, right? They don't have, they are a, and the banking system has some of their own internal monitors. Occasionally, some of whom become whistleblowers, and they have many thousands of what they call suspicious activity reports, SARS, that are these things that are flagged. They're like, "Ooh, this is a lot of money," and the documentation on this looks pretty weak or non-existent, and we should probably be looking at this or perhaps forwarding this to the governmental authorities, and they just don't. They just sit on it, and certainly not all of those are illicit, commerce, but some are. And the big banks that get caught, especially in Britain, Standard Chartered. Every time I watch Liverpool and they got Standard Chartered on the shirt, I go money launderer. Or HSBC. They're I think the biggest bank in Europe. Uh, they sponsor all sorts of sporting events and this and that and the other thing. It's like they've been caught money laundering for both of them for drug cartels around the world, including in Mexico and Latin America, as well as Iran, helping them evade sanctions and terror groups, moving money around and stuff, and just go, good God, it's like, it's very complex, but the data is there to at least start digging into it. And whistleblowers on the inside are like, nobody's doing a darn thing. And so we should be, significant enforcement resources should be directed there instead of going after like, we're going to go after these, small Mexican and Central American like grocery stores and stuff, and people go to and they can wire money home and they do it, electronically and for, pretty small amounts. Pay occasionally some thousands of dollars, but usually they're sending home, less than $1,000 a shot, and just what people are earning. They go in every week or 2 weeks and send home a bunch of money, and like, oh, we're gonna monitor all that. Like that's like looking through the wrong end of the telescope, man. But you gotta go where the real money is. And the Salinas family in Mexico kind of showed us that with Raul Salinas, the brother of President Carlos Salinas from 88 to 94, got caught money laundering through Citibank. And he's just a relatively minor bit player in a, although a significant one, in the sense of being the president's brother. And but there's so much more money flowing through the system. These cartels are billions of dollars operations. They could not function without financial services. They've got to be able to put that money in the system and be able to move it around. They're getting help from the world's financial organizations who are willing to kind of look the other way because they get very, very nice fees. And either knowingly or unknowingly going through this. And we choose to not focus on that part of the problem. We choose to focus on, again, like I stayed kind of the wrong end of the telescope. And the other part, of course, is demand reduction. The drugs are all coming here for us, our users, for the most part. And if we want to have less drug trafficking, we've got to do something about demand. And we need to look at our own society, like why are so many people addicted to these things? Why are they, so popular? And the role in the opioid crisis of the pharmaceutical industry looms large. That led us right into the fentanyl crisis. Goes from the pharmaceutical industry over to you create a bunch of addicts with the drastic overprescribing of opioid medications, sets up a whole new market for illegal drug traffickers, and they switch to fentanyl and are gradually, it seems to be, figuring out how to make it a little less lethal, so overdose numbers are coming down, and but still a huge, huge, huge problem. And the fentanyl crisis would not have been nearly so drastic if the pharmaceutical industry hadn't set up hundreds of thousands of deaths prior to that, and millions of addicts through its practices to seek profit. And again, there have been some civil lawsuits against them, but very, very few criminal prosecutions. And we should be looking at those actors as well. Right, we will instead devote lots of money to low intensity conflict doctrine. That's we're not going to devote much money to white collar crime units, or financial crime units. We're going to spend more money on the intelligence community looking in the other direction, and the military and the various police agencies that are not looking at those kinds of things yet.
Absolutely. So it seems like what we've got here is a situation where militarized state violence is applied against vulnerable people because they are not in a position to politically influence the government's priorities, whereas policies that would be costly for powerful and politically entrenched and wealthy individuals would involve going up against interest groups that actually have the ability to influence policy. And so, to some extent, this militarism that you're arguing is ineffective at actually solving the problems that people are saying it's intended to solve is pursued instead of more effective tactics because of the incentive structure associated with what we might, following scholars like Gabriel Kolko and Randall Holcomb, call a system of political capitalism, in which economic and political elites have mutually beneficial relationships that results in a set of policy priorities that are harmful for the general population. Is that a fair summary of how you're thinking about it?
For the most part, correct. And I do think, members of these targeted groups are not necessarily just passive. Certainly outgunned, so to speak, literally and figuratively, politically, capital-wise and all the rest. But, there is pushback, and people resist and try to carve out meaningful lives in all the ways they can. And sometimes those have, really meaningful results. But it's as we think of it, a dynamic, interactive relationship but an asymmetrical one.
Yeah. I really appreciate you bringing agency into the foreground there because I think sometimes when we're talking about big political structures, we can speak as though it's inevitable, but there absolutely have been throughout the entire period that we're talking about here, social movements standing up for those who are affected. And you mentioned your participation in some of them. I've been writing with some colleagues recently on the sanctuary movement in the 1980s, which was various religious communities in the US working in conjunction with and in solidarity with Central American asylum seekers and people on the Central American left. And so there's all these opportunities for agency. We're just operating in a context where political incentives are aligned in a way that might make it harder for some people to exercise agency than others.
Yeah. And, there are all sorts of informal ways as well. There are these kind of formal social movement-y kind of activities by organization, small grassroots organizations, often in that case religiously inspired. But there are lots of others as well, that we need to give more attention to. And some do, but it's kind of like looking for the ants, so to speak. But the ants are really powerful. Yeah. You know, yeah, they are amazing beings, and so are the rest of the broader public in the face of these powerful organizations. And it's the elites who control and run these organizations, but there is a certain organizational reality that is apart from any individual that's bigger than them. And the power they wield this is where, whether it's border enforcement agencies or corporate interests, this is where human rights issues are most at risk.
Yeah, absolutely. So, since we've brought up human rights issues here, what's the current human rights situation look like when it comes to the effects of border policies and immigration policies? And how does the current context of human rights effects connect back to the history that we've been discussing so far?
Well, that's such a massive topic. There's so many different layers to it and ways to look at it. But just to scratch the surface, I think we can see over many decades now, since really immigration enforcement was much expanded starting in the early 90s, building off of the Bush administration, but especially into the Clinton administration. And this has really been a bipartisan phenomenon. This is not one party or the other. Although in recent years, we tend to think of it as more, mainly Republican. That is definitely not the case. And you look in the, several decade time period, it's been very bipartisan. But as immigration expanded, enforcement there, beginning in El Paso with Operation Blockade, they implemented the new doctrine there in the early 90s that in 1994 is codified as the Border Patrol National Strategy as the prevention through deterrence doctrine, which wasn't about prevention, or it was a very selective prevention. It was preventing unauthorized crossings in major urban areas near San Diego, near El Paso, near Brownsville, McAllen in the lower Rio Grande Valley, near Nogales in Arizona, to Nogales, Sonora, and Arizona. These were places that, especially in California near San Diego and El Paso, three-quarters of all unauthorized crossings took place in those two places, mainly very near or within the city core. And the strategy of the Border Patrol was then to really not try to prevent people from crossing, but wait till they crossed and then apprehend them once they're crossed. And then they would boost their numbers and say, oh, see, we got 1 million apprehensions. We got 1.5 million, whatever it is, you need to give us more money and agents and so on and so on. And this caused a lot of problems, though, because in the process of apprehending unauthorized border crossers, they couldn't really tell what the difference was between them and many local residents in nearly all of these communities, with the exception at that time of San Diego. But in the border neighborhoods, it would be different. But otherwise, in all these communities, the majority of the population is Hispanic. And, unless somebody is dressed very differently, say like a Guatemalan indigenous person or something, or has, coming across the river, has wet clothes or something, it can be very difficult to determine who's an unauthorized crosser and who's a local resident and who is a legal crosser. There are millions of people with border crossing cards that allow them to come in for up to it's either 48 or 72 hours to shop and visit. And not supposed to use them for work, but people often do. But they have within a 25-mile area of the border, they can come and go pretty freely. And a lot of people, local residents, were being racially profiled by the Border Patrol. And eventually, In El Paso, they fought back against that and filed a federal lawsuit and got an injunction from a judge saying, hey, you can't racially profile people. You can't just arrest somebody or question, stop, and detain them because they're brown and they live, pretty near the border, because there's a lot of neighborhoods that literally go right up to the river almost. It's a very dense urban core. And they're lower income areas. So, people look kind of, poor. And gosh, we think of Mexican immigrants as being quite poor. Sometimes it's, very difficult to tell the difference. And many people have families on both sides of the border and stuff. I mean, they're literally transnational folks. So the citizens and legal residents challenged that. And the Border Patrol then said, oh, shit, what are we going to do if we can't do this racial profiling? And they brought in a new Border Patrol chief, Silvestre Reyes, who was the first Hispanic chief, and he was a local resident of the area. And he came up with a strategy of, okay, we're going to put people out on the river, just trying to stop on the border itself to prevent them from crossing during in the urban care area. He said like a 20-mile stretch, but it was really more like a 10 to 15-mile stretch of the most densely populated part of the urban area between the two cities that adjoin each other, Ciudad Juarez and El Paso. And it was tremendously popular because it got the Border Patrol out of the neighborhoods from dragooning, local school kids and residents and all these people that were complaining they're having their rights violated. And they looked pretty clear. The case was quite strong. And it had gone on for generations, for decades. And go out there and discourage the Mexicans that were coming illegally. Many Mexican Americans also had grievances against them. I felt like these are the people who are petty criminals. They're stealing the stuff off my laundry in my backyard, or committing shoplifting, or other things. There were a lot of, and so it revealed the kind of splits between Mexicans and Mexican Americans that they played on very successfully. And anyway, it's very popular among Mexican Americans, and it was very successful in reducing unauthorized crossings in that area. There was that prevention in that urban area, that 10, 15-mile zone. But what it did was it just pushed it to the outer lying areas and the more rural areas. And so crossings, as these operations were implemented up and down the border in these urban areas, Operation Gatekeeper the next year in San Diego, the number of crossings didn't drop. And the number of apprehensions overall border-wide didn't drop. Just where they took place was shifted. It was kind of like putting a rock in a stream, the water just goes around it. And so people were put out in these more remote areas. And since that time, one of the big human rights impacts has been more people die as they're pushed to these remote, desert and mountain areas and brush, South Texas, kind of mesquite brush, really, really hot areas. You've seen the number of border deaths of crossers rise from around 200 people a year to an average of like 300, roughly one a day, like 350 to 400. And then occasionally at 2022, for instance, be over 500. In 2022, it was almost 900. And those are just physical remains recovered. They don't account for people reported as missing who never turn up. And there have been shown to be undercounts. The Border Patrol doesn't necessarily count stuff collected by the local medical examiner, but not by them, right? And so, because a lot of the numbers are coming out from the Border Patrol, there's no other border-wide monitoring system to count the numbers of estimated, who looked like they might have been a border crosser, were found in a certain place, and so on. And so the numbers are about 10,500 people's remains have been collected from 93 to 2022. And estimates by scholars are that's probably an undercount by at least, the very least, a doubling, maybe upwards as many as 8 to 10 times as many. And in Southern Arizona, Jason De Leon did this great book called Land of Open Graves, about how there are just so many human remains, and as a lot of the traffic got funneled through Southern Arizona, which is exceptionally dangerous territory, that they just find fragments of bodies much more often than we could imagine, and we'll never know how many people. But a study by rights groups in Tucson did find that the 911 calls are rerouted when it sounds like it's a border crosser, because now we do have cell coverage even in pretty remote areas. They'll call in sometimes to say, they want to be apprehended, they give up, please come get me, I don't want to die. And they're out of water, been in the desert for days, blah, blah, blah. That in 61% of the time, they don't go search. They reroute those calls to the Border Patrol. And I believe it's 2021 or 22, they had the data for 61% of the time, the Border Patrol didn't go look for anybody. There's a, we would never do that to a citizen calling in, say, "Oh, I'm in distress. I think I might die," but their lives are valued less, and they're difficult to get to out there. But the Border Patrol have all this hardware. They do rescue a lot of people, but a lot of times they don't. I mean, they it's up to them, their discretion, and they certainly don't enjoy seeing people die. But of course, sometimes they destroy water left out by aid groups that are trying to ensure that people can get enough water to survive if they're on their journey and stuff. And that deaths issue is, we will never know how many people this is over this 30-year time period. But I'd say we could safely assume it's you know at the very least 25,000 people, probably more like 50 to 100,000, in that range somewhere. And we do have more reports now of missing people. Like, we have a better way of tracking, like, how many people are cropping up missing and never heard from. And certainly some of those are results of deaths. But it's very hard. It's really hard to get a very good number on this.
Yeah, that's just awful. And I think, so just for clarification on the report you mentioned, was that one by No More Deaths, No Mas Muertes, or by a different rights group?
Yeah, and no more deaths. Yeah, and I think they did it in conjunction with Derechos Humanos,
That sounds right. Yeah,
they work together a lot. There are a number of advocacy groups in Tucson. It's been very active place for organizations trying to challenge this stuff over the decades, really.
Yeah, I mean, Tucson was also where the sanctuary movement got its start in the first place at Southside Presbyterian, and then since then, obviously, a lot of this humanitarian aid work has grown up out of there. One thing I want to really emphasize, because I think the horrific consequences of prevention through deterrence are really important for some of our listeners who are economists to understand, because economists often like to talk about deterrence, drawing on Gary Becker's work on the economics of crime. And the logic is simple, right? People respond to incentives. So if you raise the cost of carrying out an action, you'll reduce that action. And sure, that's right as far as it goes, but you don't know exactly how people are going to substitute. And when you've got desperate people for whom getting into the US means more safety from violence and repression, means better economic prospects and security from poverty, right? What you're going to have in terms of your deterring crossing in these relatively safe population center areas, yeah, you'll deter that, but people are going to substitute in ways that might not be the ones that you intend. And even if it's costly to cross through the deserts and mountains, it's going to be, prior to the trip, it's going to seem worth it to try. And so you can deter in the narrow sense of deterring crossing at the areas you've fortified, but there's going to be a pattern of unintended consequences. People are going to substitute to things that might not be what you intend. And as a result, in this case, we're talking hundreds and then thousands, tens of thousands of deaths, right? And so the sort of economist as technocrat approach of, I can just increase the cost of this thing so as to reduce an undesired behavior, trying to engage in that social engineer mentality using the tools of economics can lead you to really dangerous places really quickly.
Well, and in criminology generally, deterrence theory has a less than stellar track record. It's very mixed at best, and so, as logical as it sounds, it's a wonderful argument to make to people, because it's very logical, and it's clear. It's very popular politically. It makes a lot of sense to people on an intuitive basis. But one of the things they failed to consider, and Doris Meisner, who was the head of the INS, Immigration Naturalization Service, kind of the forerunner to CBP during the 90s, that oversaw the Border Patrol and this strategy, she said later, by the end of her tenure at the end of the Clinton administration, we thought This would deter people. If they were, we knew we were going to displace them to more hostile terrain. It would be more dangerous. It would put them in mortal danger. Like they acknowledged that in their documents. Like we're going to put people in danger. But she said their assumption was then people would see how dangerous it was. They wouldn't come. And she said it became pretty clear after a couple of years that was wrong. And we started having all these deaths, and this becomes a controversy and an issue in and of itself, particularly in that region. Even though they're kind of out of sight, out of mind, they're taking place in these very remote areas. It still becomes a political problem for them. It would have been much worse if they'd been taking place in urban areas where very visible, but it still becomes a problem. And she just said they decided they had to continue with it because we couldn't go back to the old way. So she's given this kind of binary of like, well, it has to be what it was before, or we got to do this way that kills a bunch of people. And like, there's no other alternative. Like that's just insane. And she really suffered. And she of all people, you had worked at the Carnegie Endowment for Peace before her tenure and after, so should have a better grasp of these things. But in a typical kind of, I would say, very ethnocentric sort of American empire sort of mentality of like, we don't think about the other people's like perspective much. We just think, well, of course they're coming because America's great. And it is, right? Got all these wonderful things. They're just coming here for these opportunities and they're desperate. But it may still be rational for people to take those risks, even if they're much greater risks, because the situation they're coming from is so dire. Like there's just no work for a lot of people. There's just no way to provide for their families, or they're seeking safety from violence. It's just like this becomes very rational because as difficult and horrible as the border crossings are, and I think there's a lot of research that can be done if people will talk, but most people won't talk about how difficult the crossings were and what they saw and what they experienced. As difficult as they are, most people get through, right? And so it's like eventually, right? It may take multiple tries and all that, but they get through it. So it's still rational because it's rational, especially because they need it so desperately. And we have no idea how deep that need is. We have a very superficial understanding of that. And we have no idea how U.S. policy is helping drive some of those heightened needs for this escape. And so, like some of the more enlightened border enforcement people have said, even like during the Bush administration, were like, who was his borders are? Was it Alan Burson? That was the first, maybe that was under Clinton, or who that Mayork? That wasn't Mayorka. That was the last administration. One of the guys in there was saying, hey, we got to have comprehensive immigration reform. You can't just do this at the border. You're not going to solve this issue only at the border. You have to create more legal routes for people to come that match up with what the United States needs are and with humanitarian law. And you have to legalize the people who are here that are undocumented. And I saw a shocking statistic the other day that 45% of the undocumented have lived here more than 20 years. And another 30% have lived here more than 10 years. So the average length of time that someone's lived here is more than 15 years. So when these people are being scooped up and deported, many of them have been here for a long, long time. They have deep roots in the United States. So, it becomes, anyway, the deterrence theory did not have the desired effect and created a lot of unintended consequences that there was no accountability for. They're allowed to continue. And nobody really does much to try to address them except these volunteer groups, and some policymakers try and push and stuff, but with limited success. But there's also, if you look at, I would like to shift gears a little bit to what I think is a more contemporary issue. Operation Lone Star in Texas as kind of the blueprint for what the Trump administration would like to do border-wide. That Governor Greg Abbott, starting in 2021, expanded border enforcement by state troops, by National Guard, which are under state authority, except when they are federalized. Even though the Pentagon pays for most of their budget, they're technically under state authority. The governor is the commander-in-chief, just as the president is of the military federally. The governor directed more National Guard, as well as state police, Department of Public Safety, to the border. They said upwards of 10,000 to engage in border enforcement because there were growing numbers of people coming after COVID and the early part of the Biden administration. Coming out of COVID, there's this big backlog of people fleeing countries where things did not get taken care of nearly as well as they did here. And there's a backlog of people that have been trying to come before anyway and have been put on hold and during the latter part of the Trump administration. And so they start processing and taking asylum applications. And there's this big flood of people coming and in certain locations particularly. And the Texas National Guard is out there with the Border Patrol working alongside them sometimes, but at other points kind of very independently and staking stuff off and telling the Border Patrol they can't go there. And with the DPS with state troopers. And particularly around Eagle Pass, they were very visible, which is Eagle Pass. I believe the counter city there is Piedras Negras, a relatively smaller city crossing point southwest of San Antonio, like 150 miles. And then El Paso in far west Texas became two of the places where they really put people out in large numbers. El Paso later, after the mayor relented, he was initially wasn't down for it, but as the numbers really went up and they felt very overwhelmed, said, okay, come out. And yeah, these National Guard troops like chasing people up and down the border and threatening them and telling them to go back, and even instances where they've shot plastic bullets at people across the border, and aid groups that have gone over to treat injuries say, yeah, that's what this is. This is a border, and all sorts of just crazy stuff, and people crawling through concertina, layers of concertina wire, barbed wire, buoys floating in the middle of the river down by particularly Eagle Pass that have made it more difficult to the way to cross, and several people have been killed, and Texas officials being told, or officers and guardsmen being told, push people back in the river, even women and children. And one DPS guy wrote a memo complaining about this, saying he did not think that was right, that they would drown, that children and pregnant women and so on, that this is not humane. You can't do this. So even some of the people involved in the program really don't. And a lot of the guardsmen deployed out there, they're not really doing all that much. They're just kind of sitting on their hands a lot. It's really boring. It's more political theater, but sometimes it gets pretty gruesome. And, that's what President Trump would like to do border wide, is be a much more aggressive kind of program using a lot of National Guard troops. Now, the blue states probably aren't going to volunteer their troops for that. So you might have to federalize them for that, or bring in troops from other states or something, which they've talked about. But Arizona is a purple state, but has a Democratic governor. California, New Mexico are blue states. It's going to be harder to do there, but that's the model. It's like what Abbott has put forward is this is what we're going to do. And supposedly Texas was due to get reimbursed something like they were spending Texas state money to do this. And the last round of it was something like $4 to $6 billion over a biennium period for border enforcement. And Texas is a low tax state with pretty they do not have a lot of state services, so this is a lot of money for them, even though they're a big state. They are due to get reimbursed in that tax bill something like $15 or $20 billion for what they had done over the previous, because they've been doing stuff since like Rick Perry's time, since 2009 or something. But especially since 2015, they've really expanded, and especially the last 4 years under Governor Abbott. So, they're probably going to get some money back for that. But that's kind of the model then of having the National Guard more directly involved and saying under Texas law, they can make arrests. They haven't very often, but they can. U.S. regular military can't, but National Guard can when they're under state control, and they can turn people over to the police and the courts and so on. And, now we're seeing that this is kind of coming to the interior with ICE, right? And the model that they're kind of going for there is to take some of this long-standing kind of relationships that have been built between the military and border enforcement and immigration enforcement at the border through these, smaller scale programs. Usually there's maybe 1,500 to a couple thousand troops out there. Under Trump, it's been more like 5,000 to 10,000. Under President W. Bush, the second Bush, they expanded it to 8,000 at one point. as they were trying to ramp up Border Patrol. So there's been differing layers, but it's always been, you know, generally less than 15,000, usually less than 10, and along with 20,000 Border Patrol out there, that and the wall and the cameras and everything, much of which is kind of military hardware, and they're bringing some of that stuff they've experimented with and put into practice out there for decades to the interior by saying we're going to have Department of Homeland Security has a request to the DoD at the I think it was April 25th for 20,000 National Guard to assist ICE in interior enforcement. Transporting, detaining, but also in operations. And they're supposed to get a response within 90 days. That would be the end of this month. So keep your eyes and ears open for that, because if the DoD says, yeah, we'll give you 20,000 National Guard, you couple that with ICE getting a quadrupling of their budget under the tax credit laws. They're getting something like 160, 170 billion for border enforcement in the next 4 years. So like 40 billion a year, and it doesn't all go to ICE. Some of it goes to expand the wall and other things, but a big chunk of it goes to ICE. They're going to have a lot more money. It's going to be hard to grow that fast. They're probably going to have to spend a lot on contractors, which they may be using already a lot as agents, because the agents don't provide any ID or anything. It's hard to know who they're using even to come apprehend people. But what we've seen in Los Angeles, where they mobilize 4,000 National Guard, 2,000 Marines to come out there and keep security around federal buildings and so on, because of that looks like a riot or insurrection, and it's really nothing close to an insurrection. And the law enforcement seems to have it well in hand, so it was not going to be a riot. But yeah, there were a few scenes of property violence for sure, but relatively minor in the grand scale. Most of the protests were peaceful. That this becomes the excuse for the Trump administration to bring out the troops. They want to do that. I mean, that's the model. And so if they get these 20,000 National Guard, that's not a huge number, but it's enough to really amplify the presence of ICE. And we will see National Guard in the streets helping ICE do enforcement operations in ways that we have never seen before in this country, at least not absent very large scale protests and riots and uprisings in the, most recently, George Floyd, but even then the National Guards were, rarely called out, if at all. But really, Baltimore 2015, Freddie Gray uprising, and of course Rodney King 1992, those riots, police violence, response to police violence riots, or uprisings. We're going to see that kind of scale, at certain places. And they're really targeting, specific kind of, so-called sanctuary cities, blue states, blue cities, go in there and grab people. And, it's not just criminals that they're going for. Increasingly, the data show that 70% in recent weeks and months, 70% of the people that they're apprehending have no criminal record. And of those who do, half of them have a criminal record only for an immigration offense. They were cited coming in illegally, have a criminal case for that. So, and of the remaining half, most of the remaining half of that 30% is like another 15%. Most of them are nonviolent offenders. Only a very small fragment of those are violent offenders. And so they're like, oh yeah, the people who are really dangerous are actually a very tiny portion of this. Everybody else is, and so people are starting to respond to, oh, they're taking people in our community who are just like, we live with immigrants in our communities. They're working in businesses we patronize or work at. They go to school with our kids. They play on sports teams with our kids. They're parts of, deep parts of communities, part of churches and civic organizations. And you're just like, wait, don't take them. They're hardworking, regular people. As President Trump has acknowledged, right, in some of his comments, oh, some of those agricultural and hospitality workers are good people. They're doing important work. We should get them longer-term visas. Like, yeah, these people were essential workers during the pandemic. They did a lot of important, backbreaking, dangerous work, and now they're disposable. It's like we gotta And people don't want to see that. The public So now public opinion is really moving against the Stephen Miller version of mass deportations because they're not criminals. They're only in the sense of being here illegally. Technically, yes, that's a criminal offense, but most of them haven't been prosecuted for it. And those that have, that's the only thing they've been prosecuted for. They haven't been prosecuted for anything else very significant, if anything. And people don't like that. Removing people who are residents from communities does not work. And that's what we saw in the border region too, by the way, is they expanded enforcement. They went out into some of the outlying colonia communities where residents live without regular services or poorer residents, more recent immigrants, some of whom are undocumented. As they put more checkpoints and border enforcement in collaboration with county sheriffs and state police out there, this became very unpopular. They say, yeah, go get those people over there at the border that are coming illegally. Leave us alone. We've been living and working here for a while. We have 17 million people live with an undocumented family member, and there's so many mixed status households. And right now, it's pretty clear they're apprehending people. A lot of them have visas, and they're not just going after the undocumented. And so you're like, okay, this is getting really much broader, much messier, and with little, if any, due process or oversight. And so this is when human rights problems can become much more magnified and amplified. And that's what we're starting to see. And all kind of with this kind of militarized approach to immigration enforcement, gradually moving from the border to the interior.
What we're observing is functionally we've built up all these violent militarized approaches to social control. We deployed them abroad, then we deployed them at the border. And on those contexts, maybe people in the domestic interior are thinking, oh, this is distance from me, this is violence against the other. But eventually, that type of violent social control, once a state has it, they're not just going to use it in one sphere. And so that's being deployed in domestic communities in a way that really endangers individual liberty and basic human rights. And the other thing that I think is really crucial here, you mentioned that, you know, people have all these social ties with immigrants, and whether that's a thin tie of like a mutually beneficial economic relationship or a deep tie of these are my neighbors, these are people who go to my church, these are people who I have real interpersonal relationships with that are meaningful, or as a coworker or whatever else, right? That sort of natural instinct for human sociability and human solidarity becomes itself a target of state violence. And we see that whether it's the efforts to criminalize and prosecute people for doing no more deaths, humanitarian aid on the border to reduce the deaths we were talking about from prevention to deterrence, or whether it's, doing these massive militarized shows of force in cities to try and stop people from defending their neighbors, right? Like ultimately, what we're looking at is the use of militarized force to try to suppress the basic pro-social cooperative aspects of humanity.
And by militarized, I think, I never gave you, I'm sorry, a good answer to the question, what do you mean by militarization? It's like the simple definition for me is the police acting more like the military, kind of a militarized police, which the Border Patrol have long considered themselves to be a fairly paramilitary sort of force, and ICE not so different. And then the military acting more like the police. And then they're working together, collaborating in these various relationships and forces and task forces and operations and this and that, particularly in the border region that was built up and made very, kind of institutionalized as this is a normal thing, but then moving inward. And that can be also include things like just the sharing of equipment, like this turning over of Pentagon equipment to local police forces. And like I live in a town of 30,000 people, and our county sheriff in a county that has a population of like 100,000, we have a striker. We have a militarized armored personnel carrier. It's with wheels though, not the tracks, but it's really huge, destroys streets if you deploy it and stuff. Like, what do we need that for? Like there's no conceivable reason for us to need that. But the Pentagon's giving them away for free. They got some. Who wants one, right? Whether it's M4, M16 rifles, various observation and surveillance equipment, leftover personnel carriers, you name it, we got it. And would you guys like some? And they started to put some limits on post Freddie Gray, post Ferguson, all this. We see militarized police coming out there and like, oh, that doesn't look very good. What are they doing that? And so, okay, we're going to put a few limits on that. But then that just gets subject to the whim of whichever part, administration is in power. And the Trump administration comes back in and says, no, 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 we'll open the gate. Let's do some more. And so there's this sharing of equipment and some training so people can use this stuff, in addition to regular collaboration between these units, and just the warrior mentality taking over police agencies, where they get this warrior training and think like they're at war, and it's like, no, you're not. Like, you're public servants. The bad guys you're trying to get are not the enemies that you need to hunt down and kill. They're people you need to arrest, and see if they're guilty and prosecute them, and then bring in the military themselves, which is the higher end of the militarization. But we're seeing that more, and just the building of the collaboration between them and again some of the intelligence units as well. These varying parts of of the, not just national security, but just the security apparatus writ large, from the community level on up, to say we want to get you guys all working on this issue or this problem, which now has been shifted to, oh, it's immigration. It's not drugs, it's not terrorism, it's immigration. And this is going, yeah, you get this tool, you create this apparatus of coercive resources that you can mobilize. Who would have thought, if you build all these coercive tools, that somebody might use them for this? Well, that's what's happening. They used them a little less drastically certainly before, but they were using them now that somebody's come into power and said, oh, we can do a lot more with that. Let's go. And including an administration that seems to be, kind of agnostic about whether or not they need to follow court decisions. The rule of law is kind of at stake here. Like, if the court rules like, no, you can't do that, will they stop? We're going to find out, because there's going to be a lot of court cases working their way through the system on this, which is one of the ways people and groups can resist, but it takes a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, yeah, we see these militarized dynamics in the form of hardware, in the form of mindset, in the form of training, in the form of organizational structures. But yeah, I think that, yeah, you've really hit on why this is incredibly important to human freedom these days and to the preservation of the rule of law. So just to conclude, what advice would you give to people who want to learn more about these topics, either as a matter of doing research on them or for their own just personal education?
Oh boy. Yeah, that's a great question. I just want to go back to one other thing in terms of the bipartisan nature of this, though. First, is that as draconian as Trump makes things sound, rhetorically, and we're going to do all this, they're really bad people, we're going to get them, and all, using very dehumanizing language and so on. Obama deported twice as many people in his first term as Trump did in his first term. Obama deported more people than any other president in history. And he's the deporter in chief, and they largely did it using a program that Bush helped set up. His predecessor, that he took and then kind of took off, was this Secure Communities Act, which got the federal immigration folks connected with state and local police. So when they come across somebody who's undocumented, even if it's just for like a minor traffic offense, you can cycle them over to ICE, right? And the numbers just shot up, right? So they weren't doing as much like workplace raids and these very dramatic things, or community or neighborhood raids. They're just getting people to cycle through the criminal justice system, usually for very minor stuff, like pulled over. Like, one of the guys in our area that got swept up in this had a screw out on his taillight, and the Ocean City police stopped him, and later they when they're interrogating him, they asked him, we stopped you because we thought you were a gang member. What's up with the tattoos? And he goes, look around, man. Everybody's got tattoos. And it's like, it's a style. And the guy he was begging him to let him go because he had a 6-year-old daughter. He was a single parent. He had to get home. She was with a neighbor. And the police go, oh, you're not an MS-13 member or something like that. You're you're a father, you're a working father, single father. It's like, yeah. And so they actually let him go instead of turning him over to ICE, which would have been more common. But gradually, that program fell apart because the secure communities, because communities and then states, state after state, started passing laws saying, we're not going to collaborate with this because you're disrupting these communities, and nobody trusts the police if they think they can be turned over to ICE for, anything. They're not going to be witnesses, not going to report crime, nothing. And so I said, you're making communities less safe by removing really people who are not guilty of any serious offenses or rarely. And so that's where these so-called sanctuary laws came, was in response to that program. That was largely, and that was a form of resistance, a way of challenging these policies that. And then Obama was looking for reelection, and he implemented DACA, and gave some people some relief, and he was willing to kind of scale it back by the latter couple of years of his second term. But that was not his intention initially. For the first 5 to 6 years, they were very high numbers, and Trump has never come close to those. And Stephen Miller and Trump really, really want to. So that's why they have these high quotas to arrest more people, and they're getting fewer and fewer criminals in the process. So the ways to learn more about this stuff would be, first and foremost, follow the news, see what the reporting is from your different news sources. Try to look at different sources so you can compare, so we don't just stick in our news silos, as hard as it is to avoid the algorithms. Because there is a lot of reporting coming out about the effects of the current enforcement efforts and how it's sweeping up a lot of regular people who are just good people. And Todd Miller's work, as we've mentioned, great stuff. He's written 3 or 4, I think 4 books on the border, and looking at case studies from around the world as connections to that. And he's an investigative journalist, so his work is really well written and accessible. And he cites a lot of researchers and others, and does a lot of his own research to just find out amazing stuff. Looking at also some of the immigration rights groups to see what they're posting, get that narrative or that version of events, because it's not as widely reported. Go see what No More Deaths is putting out. Go see what CHIRLA, the California Humane Immigration Coalition, is putting out, or other, look for immigration task forces in your area. The ACLU puts out a lot of good stuff, some of the bigger organizations. Then you can kind of dig down into the smaller ones to see what are they reporting, what are they seeing, what are they concerned about. And if you're feeling ambitious, look up some scholarly work, such as your own, mine, others that we cite, that we use. Jen Correa has written about, from the periphery to the core. Her and one of her colleagues have written some stuff about that. Peter Andres, Joe Nevins, many, Jason De Leon, Jeremy Slack, many others have written, extensively about both the contemporary and the historical. Kelly Lytle Hernandez, MacArthur Genius Award winner, as was Jason De Leon. Right? Really written up some important work about this that gives us the bigger context. Josiah Heyman, Nestor Rodriguez, just you start looking for stuff and you will find a wealth of materials to look at. And I guess from my own field, Douglas Massey has been the biggest scholar in sociology for a lot of this, with colleagues in Mexico, Jorge Duran and others. So he gets that binational perspective built into their work. That's really valuable. And we need to start paying more attention to our colleagues in Latin America and say, what are you seeing? What's the reality there on your end? There's a lot of great quality work being done there as well. And lastly, I would say, look at what, the push-pull conditions. The push, part of the push is not only this military and security aid stuff, it's some of the trade policies as well. How has NAFTA, CAFTA, and other free trade agreements led to a worsening of conditions that leads certain segments of the country, lower income folks, to need to leave? And as well, Venezuela and Cuba. John Bolton, the previous national security advisor for Trump in the first administration, for a chunk of that, he helped implement heightened economic sanctions against both Venezuela and Cuba, countries that we're not, on friendly terms with, but neither of which poses any real threat to the United States. But we were busy trying to overthrow them. We want to get rid of their governments for, Cuba's case, many decades, but for Venezuela, over 20 years. And they were told by State Department people, if you put this, they already had sanctions in place, but they said, if you heighten the sanctions, these are the most severe sanctions we've ever put on a country outside of wartime. If you do that, you will see a bigger outflow of people. You have a migration problem. And some of them will come to the US. And the State Department said, yeah, this is what's going to happen. And they said, we don't care. We're going to do it anyway. And they did. Migration usually takes second fiddle to larger geopolitical concerns. And out migration from Venezuela went from like 1.5 million to over 7 million in the next 7 years. And about 1 million of that wound up in the US. Most of it is in Colombia, neighboring, and other Latin American nations. They've paid the real price of trying to, accommodate these people who are fleeing hardship and violence. But, that's a direct result of, the problem was already there, but that's a direct result of John Bolton. And he put in those sanctions, and he started citing the Monroe Doctrine, saying how America gets to call the shots in the Western Hemisphere. This is our backyard. Like, I don't know how anyone with a straight face could do that, but when they make these kind of decisions that most Americans who don't follow foreign policy all that close, you have no idea, have real impacts on migration. So all of a sudden, we get like an extra, 800,000 Venezuelans coming in the last 4 or 5 years. And it's like, that's why John Bolton, that's not the only reason, but that's a big part of the reason. And they could turn that off. And Biden didn't, right? He just left that policy in place because there's this bipartisan consensus of, oh yeah, Venezuela sucks. We really got to change the government. Even if you think that, is that really the way to do it? Because in the meantime, you're going to have a huge outflow of people that are, by the way, going to sink your chances or your colleagues' chances for re-election. And they just don't care. And the consequences that American communities have to cope with, they don't care either. So just like, we have to be more in tune with the United States' role in helping, unfortunately, create some of these push conditions or worsening them. And really, do those align with our values? What is a better way to create more opportunities for people in safety so they don't have to come? Because most people would prefer not to have to leave. They want to stay in their homes. And how can we help them have the right not to migrate? And that's where people are really at. And that's a bigger discussion, but we certainly need to think about that. And then for people who do want to come and need to come, creating more welcoming alternatives and protection for people who come. So even if they come with a visa, so they're not terribly exploited, so they're treated fairly under the law, they have certain rights even as non-citizens. There have been several cases of slavery prosecuted with people who had visas, who had H-1A visas. They came to do temporary agriculture work, but there was cases down in South Georgia in the onion fields of slavery. And you're just like, they came with visas, for God's sake. How does this happen? Because there's so little enforcement, there's so little follow-up. And we need, the non-governmental agencies, the NGOs, the advocacy groups, the unions, other non-state actors out there, the health centers, more able to get out there, more willing to get out there to document this stuff and to prevent it and make sure people know they have rights and they can get cared for. And they can, if they're here on a visa, they should be treated fairly. And if they're not here with a visa, is there some way we can regularize that status? If they're doing essential work and they have close ties to the United States? Right now, we say there's something like 70% of the American public thinks the undocumented immigrant population ought to have a pathway to legal status, probably to legal permanent status, but some kind of legal status if they've been working and paid their taxes and don't have a serious criminal record. It's like, if 70% of the public thinks that, and they have pretty much consistently since the late 2000s, 2007, 2008, why does that never become policy? Why did these political entrepreneurs become so successful at exploiting the idea that they're here to kill us, that they're terribly dangerous, and riling up a lot of racism in the process? We're very conflicted about this, but I think most people see people who are living and working here like, no, we should do something to make it safe for them and their families, and other people who need to come. We got to have a better way, right? And there's no incentive structure for the political class to do that, or the economic actors that really might benefit from this, because immigrants are half of the labor force growth in the first 2 decades of the century, and they're going to be over 90% of the labor force growth going forward, because birth rates have dropped so much. They're already important to the U.S. economy, but they'll become much more so. And if that's the case, then we really, and most people are here legally, but for those that are here without papers or in some kind of liminal, irregular status, we've got to figure out a way to make this work. It's in our interest. It's in the employer's interest. It's in the economy's interest. It's in community's interest. Why is it not in the interest of the political class?
It's a good question.
Or the media that kind of drives some of the divisiveness to get more clicks, or what have you. Right? There's a propaganda network, a propaganda kind of media atmosphere out there that benefits from this and has helped drive this scary, evil immigrant narrative for a long time. And they have made a lot of advertising revenue off that. That's part of the problem too. It's like we need better information sources and a way to counter that sort of unfortunately effective propaganda. But some of that's happening in real practices. People are seeing, they're going, hey, wait a minute. This is not what you guys said. And I think we'll see some pushback. And communities will resist this. Immigrants resist this. Other parts of communities will resist this. All sorts of ways, large and small. Probably most of them pretty small, but it will be significant. If there are National Guard out there with ICE and communities making apprehensions, this is not going to happen with people just laying down taking it. People are going to push back. And who knows what forms that'll take. But I'm sure many, many varied forms. But I think that may help put some brakes on it. And so looking also to religious organizations to see whatever ones you feel comfortable with, to see what their positions are on these issues that are interesting, because they, as a more moral voice, often have some kind of more humane outlook on immigration and what policies ought to be.
Yeah, thank you so much. I feel like you really wrapped it up nicely there in terms of emphasizing the importance of us breaking out of our silos, not just looking within any single academic discipline or any single literature, but really looking to the whole of civil society as a place that is going to have a range of knowledge that we can learn from and that can help us imagine and understand ways that we could improve things. Because ultimately, human well-being is at risk here in a lot of ways, and there's a lot of ways that we all could do better. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Oh, you're welcome. And I encourage us all to think about the ways our lives are affected, even if we don't think they are. Like, who's caring for our elderly relatives? Who's picking the fruits and vegetables that we love to eat, especially now in the summer when it's high season and it's, great produce season. All these things, immigrant labor is such an important part of that. Of so many different aspects of our life. Sometimes, in a lot of ways, we're not aware of, but certainly it's there. And if we can keep that in mind, I think that'll help us appreciate what they provide for us, the essential work they do, and what it means to America, and the promise of America, and what we ought to think about for changes going forward.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Nathan. Thank you very much. I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.